Thank you for joining us. So with this presentation, there is so many different ways that we could have taken it, and there's a lot of different facets that we could have talked about. So this is not an exhaustive presentation. We can do this many times in different ways. So this is just basically an overview and an introduction to it, to look at a few different things with how comics are related, not just to the Holocaust, but to the idea of memory. So what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to look at what is a comic, because the idea of what comics are is not actually universal. They've got lots of different names, and they've been around for longer than you would think. So we're going to see how we get to what we call comics, and what we think of them today. We'll look at the laws surrounding that, because that is actually quite important to understanding how comics and the Holocaust are related and why they were related. And then we're going to look at specifically the propaganda that comics were used for. Oftentimes we don't think of something that's for children as being propaganda, but I think that's a misnomer to not look at it that way. And so we'll look at a few major characters from comics history and their relation to the Holocaust. Again, by no means is this an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that I felt are the most well-known, and a few of what I call the honorable mentions. And then lastly, we'll look at Zachor, memory. How are comics and graphic novels today being used to preserve Holocaust memory? At the end, there's time for Q&A. So if you have a question, Carol will come around with a mic. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and don't start talking until you have the mic so that people on Zoom can hear you. If you're on Zoom and you have a question, please type it into the chat box, and Tom here will read the question and then I will answer. So we start here. I always like to start with a quote. It's what I think is a great way to introduce the topic. And so we have the power of comics lies in their ability to combine words and image, written by Art Spiegelman, who we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Comics as a medium are not just for children. We oftentimes think about them being for children because of the fact of the drawing style and the limited use of words. But in reality, comics can convey quite complex ideas that are difficult even for adults to understand. And so when we use comics to convey those ideas, we're giving readers multiple ways to engage with the content. And that's why I was so interested in this topic, because how do we get students to engage with such a difficult topic as the Holocaust in a safe manner? So, excuse me, to begin with, how did comics come around? We have to look at the history of that. And so we start with the fact that comics actually originally were politics. They were used before the 1930s to really convey a political or social idea. They could be humorous, they could be serious, but they weren't always going to be a story-driven thing. That comes much later. In fact, the first comic book, if we want to call it that, it's more of, I guess you can say, a periodical, is from 1826, and it's from Scotland, and it's called The Glasgow Looking Glass. And this was a satire. It was commentary on the current issues of the day, mainly probably looking at the industrialization and how that was affecting the society, especially the lower class. The first humorous, non-political serialized comic was actually almost 40 years later, 1867, and it's Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. And that was the first one that was geared towards the working class. Most people prior to the modern invention of modern education could read at a very base level. So comics were a way for these people who couldn't read full books to engage with politics and with societal issues. The satirical drawings that were included here would be about the politics of the day. And the idea was that you can impact people's voting, you can impact how they engaged with politics through these pictures. One of the issues that comics prior to the 30s faced was the fact that they were so limited in space. Drawing prior to the modern publication of the 1900s was not easily reproduced. And so you couldn't just draw and mass print a comic. You had to have a special printer to do that, which limited the scope and the amount of people who were able to see comics. It wasn't until we have mass medium that comics really gain their modern style of popularity. So the first American style comic book was actually printed in 1933, and it was actually a collection of comics from previous decades. Now, most of the comics that I'm going to be talking about are actually American, because the American industry is really what developed the comic book and what we call graphic novels today. Now, the first superhero would only come out 5 years later. Does anybody know what the first superhero was? It's Superman, yes. And he's not a DC comic. It was not DC Comics, it was Action Comics. DC comes a little bit later. But these characters generally, they were going to be around three main things. One, color, red, white, and blue, because of America. And they would be a contrast to American politics, trying to convince the average person to actually go against American ideals at the time. In the 1930s, most Americans and most politicians were incredibly isolationist. They wanted to maintain their neutrality in the issues coming from Europe. They viewed that any world war that would come or any war in Europe should not involve the United States. The United States had paid enough for what they did in World War I. These comics would challenge that idea. The most popular comic of the time, though, was not Superman, it was not Batman, and it wasn't Captain America. The most popular comic was Captain Marvel. Today, we don't call him Captain Marvel, we call him Shazam. So Shazam actually sold 1.4 million issues in his first year. And that is a massive number for the 1930s. So we call this time period the golden age of comics. It's the introduction of superhero. It uses the concept of the hero's journey to teach the lessons, and it creates the serialized version of comics. So they're not just going to come in newspapers, they will come as actual magazines. I did take cough medicine, so hopefully this doesn't happen too often. So you see here on the left, that is the very first Superman, and that's Action Comics. On the right is actually Daredevil. And Daredevil is one of the first to show Hitler in this way. We will talk about both of these later on. But these types of comics, when they came out, their goal was to influence this children's parents. By teaching the children these ideas, the children then talk to their parents are the voters, therefore it spreads up. So it's a bottom-up idea rather than a top-down. We do know that as after World War II, there is a decline of comics. There's a decline of the use of comics. Part of this is due to the changes World War II wrought in society. One of the big issues of the day was obviously the nuclear bomb. And so the comics had to shift from their patriotic stories into a more story-driven, more about a tale, rather than fighting Nazis or fighting communists. Television also is going to have a major impact on the comic industry, as more and more Americans and eventually more worldwide people had television sets in their homes. Out of the golden age of comics, though, we get new comic forms. We get Mad Comics, which eventually becomes Mad TV. The reason for this is most people theorize that it helped the children deal with the anxiety of the fact that they were living in the nuclear age. Obviously, not during my time. We never did nuclear drills in schools. We did active shooter drills. But I know my parents did nuclear drills during their time. And so these comics could help them handle those types of issues. There's also the shift in focus, again, away from the patriotic nature to discovery, because this is the space race. And so you'll see more coming along the lines of about space and about solving mysteries in space. And you'll have that decline of the superhero and a rise of horror. The horror comic will be governed by law, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. So that brings us to, why are they going to be governed? What is the point of governing this? And it's about moral panic. Moral panic is not something new. It wasn't even new in the 1950s when this comes around. This was just the newest version of moral panic at the time. So the Comics Magazine Association of America was founded to control the comic industry. One thing about the entertainment industry as a whole in the United States is they try to control things in-house rather than having to have legislation passed. Because once something is legislated, there's somebody at the gate. Once something is legislated, that doesn't just affect that one industry, It affects everything. So this formation, it comes in 1954, and it's an insider regulator, and they basically are setting out a do's and don'ts for comic books. So it is based on what was known in Hollywood as the Hays Code. Now, the Hays Code was for movies. It would eventually be applied to television. One of the more famous things about the Hays Code is that it would not show interrace relations. Miscegenation, I think is how you say it. Don't quote me on that. And it also would govern how you can show sexuality. So for example, it's very well known that in certain movies, you would allow gay men, but they would never be married. They would be roommates, and they would be usually in an industry like the arts or in fashion. And they were usually a sidekick. And they would almost always have a tragic ending. That was required. It was other things about how women would be shown and women's roles in movies. So 1950s, women were supposed to be subservient to the men. Strong female leads could happen if at the end she eventually would acquiesce to a man. But the Hays Code did affect the CCA as it became known. It was voluntary. It was not required. So if you were a publisher of comics and you did not put the logo of the CCA on your comics, you could sell them, but most distributors would not. You would not get it into the big stores. There was an approval of content, what they called moral consumption, that came out of two main things. One was McCarthyism. A lot of people were afraid that there were subversive messages in comics trying to teach children to be communists, which really didn't make sense because most of the comics were in the 40s to fight communists. And also from a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. This book was written by a psychiatrist named Friedrich Wertham, and he said that comics cause juvenile delinquency. And this book became the basis of the idea of that moral panic, that comics were causing subversive issues with children. And it actually launched a congressional inquiry into the comic book industry. That is the ultimate reason why the CCA and the Comic Magazine Association of America were founded. Because again, once a law is passed, it doesn't just affect one industry, it affects all. The industry acted as a de facto censor. So there was censorship, which seems to go against the concept of freedom of speech. But as we know, freedom of speech is an ideal. It's not necessarily always upheld to the highest of its orders. And the code would actually be used up until around 2009. Now, once the 1980s arrive, the code is no longer really enforced. Most comic creators will be doing whatever they like. But the code is technically still there. So distributors could say, no, we won't distribute your comic without the actual logo. The legacy of this is that it shaped an entire generation of readers. And it also is what we're seeing today in today's moral panic, with the idea that there are subversive messages in books, regular reading books. And across the United States, we are seeing there's a big push for, I just lost the term, my mind went blank, censorship, and banning books. Books that you would think, why are we banning them? Like the Diary of Anne Frank. Why are we banning the Diary of Anne Frank? I read the Diary of Anne Frank, first time I think it was 9, but the Diary of Anne Frank that most of us read probably wasn't the Diary of Anne Frank of today, which is an unedited version. And the unedited version does include things like her discussion of her sexuality, her discussion of her relationship with her mother, things along those natures, which, quite honestly, in my opinion, what's the problem? Teenagers are dealing with this anyways. And this is something that, whether she was in hiding or not, she was dealing with. But the legacy of it is that censorship is still an issue within the industry and pressure from without. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can see. I took these pictures at the exhibition that was here in Wellington that opened up at Takina. And this was the world's exhibition of Marvel Comics specifically. But you can see the moral panic. And you've got a picture here. I don't know. Can you see my mouse? Let's see. Can you see the laser pointer? Okay, I'll zoom in a second. This is Friedrich Wertham, who wrote the book, The Seduction of the Innocent. And it was his book that caused this moral panic. The child you see, he's reading horror stories. horror stories were considered subversive because they didn't follow the Christian norm, good triumphing over evil, right versus wrong, and things like that. On the right-hand side, I'm going to scoot over here so you can see, these are some of the big parts of the comics code. Good has to triumph over evil. So you can never have the villain win. Comic magazine should use horror or shouldn't use horror or terror in its title because that could cause issues with children's nightmares. It could cause them to want to do things like that. Scenes dealing with the dead, vampires or vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, or werewolfism are prohibited. Now, I don't know if you've ever read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or if you've read Bram Stoker's Dracula, but those would have been banned. And in fact, neither of those were made into comics until the 1980s because of the fact that they couldn't be shown. No unique or unusual methods of concealing weapons. And I do find that to be quite ironic because of concealed handguns and concealed weapons and the Second Amendment. But it was always just weird. Why can't they conceal their weapons? We don't always know who villains are because they conceal their identity. And then characters should be depicted and dressed reasonably acceptable to society. Now, that one had to do mainly not just with children, but also with the way women would be displayed in comics. Women had to be dressed in a fashion that was modest. You think about Wonder Woman. If you look at Wonder Woman's whole costume, she's covered head to toe. Yes, it's form-fitting, but there's no skin showing, except for her face and her hands. Modern Wonder Woman that we saw starting in the 70s was different. Yeah. And then my favorite, respect for parents. You have to have respect for parents. Honorable behavior shall be fostered. Teenagers are teenagers. Little kids are little kids. We're not perfect. Kids are going to mouth back. It happens. But comics should not encourage that. They should not teach children to do that. And the one that really struck me was the fact that you can't use slang and colloquialisms, which nowadays, if you think about any reading, all reading has slang and colloquialisms in it if there's speech, because it's natural to whoever's writing it. They're going to write how they speak. So the way this would look, as you can see here, this was released in 1955. So this was the seal that had to go on all approved comics. With that seal, your comics could be sold at all of the major stores. And what this comic really did is this comic explained, why do we have this seal? Well, Mrs. Brown wants to make sure that her child's being protected and he's getting a good all-American education. And it goes through what is allowed and not allowed in the comic. And there would be inside comics that stamp of approval from the CCA as well as the stamp on the front. I liked right here, even the advertisements are carefully screened so that objectionable matter is eliminated. For example, advertisements of medical, health, or toiletry products of questionable nature are not acceptable. What is questionable nature? I remember seeing, commercials from the 1950s about this thing that you would stand on, it would have a band around you and it would shake you, and that's supposed to lose weight. I don't know what the machine's actually called. But that's a questionable medical device in my opinion, but that was okay. So the definition of questionable was definitely left up to the censor. X-ray vision glasses, didn't those common in comics? Yeah. Look, I read comics for a little bit, but I'll be the first to tell you, I read Scooby-Doo comics because who doesn't love Scooby-Doo? Stan Lee, probably the most famous of all comic book artists, rightfully or wrongfully, said that he never thought about the code when he was writing. Basically, he didn't want to do anything that was too violent or too sexy. He knew that young people were reading these books. So with the code or without the code, he doesn't think that he would have done the stories any differently. And I think that really kind of encapsulates the idea that we can trust some of these writers to know the right and wrong thing to do. If comics are geared towards 8 and 9-year-olds, we're not going to show them overly graphic images of sex and violence. And as he states, the code didn't really need to be there. It was a good thing, but it wasn't necessary. Stan Lee is probably the most famous who went against the code. In the 1970s, he's one of the first within Marvel to publish a comic, a series of 3 that was about drug use and about how you overcome drug use. The comics were not given the stamp, and Marvel still published them. And he said, we did go to the Department of Health and Education, and they said it was a good idea, do it. The CCA said no. So the government said, no, do this because it fights drug use. But they were being told by the censors, don't do this because it's going to encourage drug use. So how does that lead to propaganda? This is where we're getting into its relationship to the Holocaust, especially in World War II. And it relates to because we're using superheroes to combat Nazism. So initially, these comics, and we'll start with this one right here. Now, this is actually from 1950. Don't quote me on the year. I have to make sure. But this is an example of what it would have looked like. So, and remember, boys and girls, your school, like our country, is made up of Americans of many different races, religions, and national origins. So if you hear anybody talk against a schoolmate or anyone else because of this religion, race, or national origin, don't wait to tell them that kind of talk is un-American. Now, hopefully the irony is not lost on you because of race relations, especially at the time. Desegregation didn't technically begin until 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. A Supreme Court ruling does not mean that it actually happened overnight. This type of propaganda, though, was used in shaping that generation. So the first thing, oops, there we go, is that was actually to teach children to fight not just Nazism and fascism, but also to combat communism. The idea was that both were a target against American ideals, because up until 1941, technically, Soviet Union and the Nazis were allies, or frenemies, if we want to give them a better title. That meant that the United States, if they had entered the war in 1939, would have been fighting against both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So these early superheroes were designed to teach children, you've got to fight both. It's not one or the other. The comics showed that good Americans were welcoming to these refugees, fleeing Nazism and communism. And it also showed racial tolerance. Now, the racial tolerance that was being showed was mainly in the ideas of the Jewish refugees that were coming, because the creators, overwhelmingly in the comic industry, were Jewish. The idea of racial harmony, though, it comes from an idea of what we call American exceptionalism. I don't know if you've heard the term before. It's not new, but it has gained new traction recently because it's the belief that America has been different than other nations that have been created and other empires. We are the exception. We are better because we have democracy. We're the first democracy. We are better because of our expansion. We were kind to the natives when we expanded. We freed the slaves, and so therefore we're better than other countries who didn't do that. Rightly or wrongly, we can have a whole discussion on that at a different Zoom. But American exceptionalism was what they were trying to teach. And America was better than Europe because we accept these people. America is better than Europe because we don't fight over these issues of race and religion. Also, it was showing the concept of the New Deal. The New Deal was to combat the Great Depression. And there was big societal upheaval when the Great Depression happened. And the response from the government with the New Deal wasn't universally accepted. And so by showing these ideas through comics, they were able to actually convince the parents the domestic policies were correct. But I think the most important thing is that it actually promoted interventionism. It combated that isolationist idea. Because the creators were Jewish, some of them being refugees themselves, some of them having been born from refugees to the United States, either in the late 1800s or after World War I, was supposed to convince America, we can't leave the Jews to the Nazis. We have to protect them. We have to get involved. Because if America is going to be the exception to the rule, then America has to lead the way. These comics, though, they actually enraged the Nazis. Now, I'm going to show you one. It's very big, so I'm not going to cover the whole thing. This is the comic that enraged the Nazis. This is Superman. This was 2 years before the United States actually enters the war. So this is in 1940. We officially entered the war on December 7th, 1941, but troops did not actually enter the war until the following year. This comic shows how Superman could have ended the war all by himself. He flies to Europe. You see right here, he's meeting Himmel, and he goes over, he beats Himmel, and he captures Hitler in the second on the left on the screen, and he brings Hitler and Stalin to the World Court for them to be punished with their crimes. This comic so enraged the Nazis that it was repudiated in Der Schwarze Kohl, which is the Black Corps, the Nazi newspaper. There are some say that it was actually written by Goebbels himself. We don't know who wrote the report. I could not confirm it was written by Goebbels, but it was saying that this comic was indoctrinating American youth to the Jewish race and Jewish ideals. But what's really important, if I can, is where I have to find where he says non-Aryan. It's very small text even on my screen. But Superman claims to be a non-Aryan, and he's proud of it. Claiming to be the non-Aryan is on purpose because of his creators. His creators were Jews, therefore they weren't Aryan. And it's again showing that racial harmony that was found in the United States. It wasn't just Superman. It was also, you have other superheroes. Batman, you see here, is helping with the war effort. Now, Batman was officially created in 1939. Batman fights Germany's allies, Italy and Japan. The use of American symbols within the comics was to spread that idea. So this is the bond wagon. You buy the comic, you buy a bond. The two would go together. So a kid could convince their parents to support the war effort just by simply buying the comic. The way that this would work is you'll see it talks about the butcher, the baker, the girl riveter. So Rosie the Riveter, the very famous one, she's holding her arms up. The man machinist, the farmer, the banker, the housewife, and the school kid. It immobilized all aspects of society. It brought to the home front that the boys over in Europe and the boys in Asia couldn't fight alone. Everyone had to do their part. Children did their part by learning American ideals through the comics. Parents did their part by supporting that, by buying the comics and buying war bonds. So how does it relate to the Holocaust? So what I've done here is I've picked some characters that specifically relate to this topic. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There were a lot that I could choose from. When I initially put this together, this was about 3 times as long as it is. And I was like, this is too long for Lador Vador. So I've cut it down. So there are more than what I'm showing you. So just keep that in mind. The first, obviously, is Superman. Superman being the first one because of the fact that he comes out in 1938, 6 months before Kristallnacht. He is modeled off of the idea that the Jew can be strong, the Jew can fight for themselves. He is created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, 2 Jews who lived in New York. When they created Superman, they were trying to create him so that he could teach children that it's okay to be different. That's why he's not from Earth. He's from Krypton. He doesn't fight the Nazis technically. He fights the Deucalions. The Deucalions were modeled after the Nazis, though. When he comes out before Kristallnacht, nobody really knew how important he would become because when he was inspired by Samson from the Bible, but also a Polish Jewish bodybuilder. Some don't say it's yes, some say no, named Sigmund Breitbart. Breitbart was looked at as being, Jews can be strong. He broke the mold of the poor Jewish farmer, of the bookish Jew who works in an office, or of the Jew who's a jeweler or a banker, or something like that. That's what they wanted people to see. Also, his features were considered to be just average. He didn't look Jewish. Because the authors and creators wanted him to show that Jews can look like anybody. So trying to break the idea that there's a Jewish look. He began fighting the Nazis in 1940 with the one that I showed you earlier. And what he did is he was trying to get people to understand we have to have compassion for the victims. We must show that it's not just Jews that are going to be targeted. Once we go from the Jews, it'll be another group. So therefore, we have to fight the Nazis now before it continues to spread. And then you'll see down here, this comic is where they try to bring it in. So this is Superman is Clark Kent, and they're going to the games, the Deucalion Games. But you'll notice that over here, they look just the way they would have looked at the actual 1936 Olympics. So while they're not saying Nazis, while they're not saying Germany, they're still teaching that lesson that the Deucalions and the Nazis are wrong. And then this was, sorry, I don't know why it keeps doing that. This was released in 1943, and this was a comic book that was meant to show how can children fight the Nazis. So you have Superman, but what is Superman doing? Superman's showing the kids how to draw themselves. Draw yourself as the superhero. Make yourself as the one who fights back. And we see in the middle, that's what you have. Everyday person fighting Hitler, bonking him on the head, the strongest man on earth. We don't know who the strongest man is because this isn't Superman. And then over here, we see more of where this child who is making themselves into it, they are going to Europe and they're actually fighting on the front lines against the Nazis. And behind them, you see the people cheering on the superhero. That's the average person, the peasant, if you wanted to call them that, because they're kind of drawn like peasants. So it could be anybody who would fight the Nazis. It didn't just have to be politicians and the military. And in the end, you see here how they defeat the Nazis. Other superhero is Captain America. Now, Captain America comes out after Superman does. Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby's probably as famous as Stan Lee, I would say. Now, Joe Simon was his anglicized name. His name was Jaime, and Jack was Jacob Kurtzberg. So very common for people to anglicize their names. So this is a bit more upfront in how we see him fighting the Nazis. This is actually the first edition of Captain America. And you see right away, Captain America is just smacking Adolf Hitler right in the face. And he's being shot by the Nazis in the background, and the bullets aren't doing anything. This was the first time that it was so forward in giving those children that message of fighting the Nazis. It also directly informed the public of the Holocaust. I'll show you one in just a minute, because this was also the first time it was drawn. Now, this was in 1945, April 1945. It would not be what I would call graphic, but an image, they always say, is worth 1,000 words. So even a small part of it still can inform people of what's going on. And this is actually kind of going against the code. Even though the code technically isn't around, there were still ideas of what you can and cannot do. And one of those ideas is you don't put politics into a children's comic. But this is openly political. There's no way to get around it. It's openly political. It is going against the idea of America doesn't fight when you have a strong American colored superhero fighting the Nazis. So here on the left, we have the second edition of Captain America. And again, directly fighting the Nazis. You'll have to forget me. I forget who the sidekick. I don't think that's Bucky, but I could be wrong. But the one that actually we see showing the Holocaust. This is from 1945. And so in the background here, behind the young boy, you see prisoners who are being led at gunpoint. They're not wearing Stars of David, but they're wearing some sort of identification. And then down here, we have a man who's being experimented on. And then even more, if you look on the bottom left, you see a pile of ash and bone. Now, again, this isn't the most graphic way to show the Holocaust, but the message would get there. The message would have been received. And so one thing to notice with these two comics, from comparative to the first one, is the shields. Now you think, why does the shield matter? And it matters because of the way and the message that it shows. So this is actually only used on the very first comic, this shield on the top. It's only the first one. All other comics with Captain America use the round shield. I tried to find a full explanation for this, and I couldn't find a full explanation for it. So this is just my personal opinion. The top resembles too close to an American seal. And those are actually governed by law on who can and cannot use those. So that's my guess of why they changed it. Whether that's the reality of it, I don't know, but that's just my guess. So Captain America, unlike Superman and unlike Batman and Robin when they fight the Nazis, he is actively showing what's really going on. He is showing as close to reality as you can. Now, the next is Magneto from the X-Men. Now, Magneto comes after the Holocaust. Magneto and the X-Men come after. Yes, if you want a question, if you don't mind. I don't mind you interrupting, it's fine.
Sorry, Kris, just before we move on to the next topic, my quick question is this. You're showing Captain America April, so you're talking about the gap between VE Day versus VJ Day.
Right before VE Day. Yeah, right before VE Day.
Yeah, so it's just interesting the timing that you're basically producing it after the event. That was just I wonder if there was an essence of the timing of that.
So April 1945 by then you would have had the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. That was April 15th, 1945. Mauthausen was right before VE Day. You would have had the liberation of France, which would have included the French camp like Drancy. You would have had the liberation of the Netherlands by then, so Westerbork. You already would have had the liberation of most of the death camps in Poland, Mauthausen and Auschwitz. Sobibor had already been shut down. So probably, yes. There was a comic that I didn't include it because it was more about Japan and fighting the Japanese. But there was a comic superhero that was specifically designed for that. And it does show what happened in the Japanese camps within Burma and the Philippines. Yeah. So Magneto is, again, he comes after these superheroes. The X-Men do come after the war, but the reason why I included him is because, one, he's classed as a villain. But is he really? Because when you look at Magneto's backstory, that changes why he does what he does. So this is the first X-Men when Magneto is introduced. He's actually introduced in the 1960s. I want to say 1961. I should have included that in my notes, and I didn't. And it doesn't really show why Magneto hates non-mutants so much until his backstory is given a little bit later. And that's this. Magneto is technically an Auschwitz survivor. Magneto was a Jew born in the 1920s to an average middle-class German Jewish family. When he was created, and later writers would say, they modeled Magneto off of two main things. The one is they modeled him off the average survivor, so that anybody who saw Magneto could identify with Magneto. And so you see on the left, he's saying, we've learned firsthand of man's utter inhumanity to man. Well, that utter inhumanity to man is why he wants to protect mutants so much, because he suffered for being different. The woman he ends up marrying is also a survivor of Auschwitz, a non-Jewish survivor, a Romani survivor. So she also would have been targeted just as much for eradication. And so again, that's why he wants to protect the mutants. When he later is developed, one of the writers, Kris Claremont, said that he modeled Magneto off of, at the time, Israeli opposition leader Menachem Begin of the 1960s. Because prior to the birth of the State of Israel, Menachem Begin was considered a terrorist by the British. And by 1979, Menachem Begin is a Nobel Peace Prize winner because of his agreement and deal with the Egyptians. So Magneto, villain, or is he an anti-hero? His actions are incredibly shaped by what he actually experiences. And this on the far right, that comic, is where we see Magneto brought to justice. And we see Magneto recognize that not only has he become the Nazi because of how he's treating non-mutants, but he really wants to make the world a better place. He has to look at his own internal bigotry and racism. And Stan Lee actually said that he wanted to strike back at people who were so bigoted and racist that he forgot that his own actions were bigoted. And so that's also a commentary on how people reacted after the Holocaust. A lot of times, especially with students, they get asked, well, what did the Jews do to the Germans? And, how did they, get even? And it's, what is that going to do? It doesn't bring back anybody. It didn't bring back Magneto's family. It didn't take away his suffering in Auschwitz. It didn't take away the fact that his wife ends up committing suicide. All it does is pass on the suffering. So one of the reasons why Magneto does what he does is because Magneto was a Sonderkommando. So Sonderkommando, if you don't know what that is, these were a special unit within the camps. Sonderkommandos were always marked to be killed because their job was to take the bodies in the gas chambers to the crematoria and to cremate them. They were the ultimate witness. So literally, Magneto witnesses the worst of humanity and the worst of the Nazi death machine. So his backstory, it's being constantly added to. And in fact, he is the most formed of all villains, if you want to call him a villain, within the comic industry because of that. And so one of the things that they did within the X-Men is they used Charles Xavier, Professor X, as kind of his conscience. He is to show that internal struggle that Magneto has of being someone who has suffered greatly, but now is causing suffering. How do we balance that? How do we try to protect mutants who are being targeted, while on the other hand, not targeting non-mutants? And oddly enough, not oddly enough, but ironically, where do Professor Xavier and Magneto meet? They meet in a center for therapy and psychiatry in Haifa for Holocaust survivors. And that's where their journey begins. So the Holocaust is threaded into those two characters. And that's why I say, is he an actual villain? Or is he an anti-hero? It's almost up to you to decide, but one of the things that they tried to do with Xavier is show that Xavier is the personification of Jewish ideals. That we can fight for rights, we can fight for the freedom without attacking those who attacked us. And it's also the show of what we had hoped had been done for us that wasn't. We need to protect all is what they were trying to do. Some honorable mentions. You have Daredevil. Daredevil is introduced in 1941. Daredevil is a blind lawyer, and he is fighting the Nazis, and he was created to warn the American public of the evils of Hitler. In fact, he is probably the most strongest in showing that warning, as this was from one of the first editions of Daredevil. And you see here it's using the German style of pronunciation at the time. It's going to create anti-German sentiment much later. Daredevil, as well as Superman, are both also going to be fought against by the German-American Bund. The German, 1941. So the German-American Bund is an organization of German Americans who gathered together to celebrate all things German. The most famous thing they did was the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden with over 20,000 people. And the German American Bund also would put out newspaper articles against these comics. And many of you probably know Dr. Seuss. I grew up with Dr. Seuss all the time, Theodore Geisel, and he created propaganda cartoons. Now this one is probably one of the most graphic. So you have Jews hanging from a tree, and you have Hitler. I wasn't able to find out who Laval was. I probably could have found it if I had looked harder, but they're singing a song, "Only God Can Make a Tree to Furnish Sport for You and Me." And that sport obviously is Jew hunting. Vichy France. Okay. He produced a lot of these cartoons for a newspaper in New York called PM, which was a left-leaning newspaper. And this one is from 1942. And it was showing this is the fate of European Jewry if we don't do anything. Some other honorable mentions are going to be actually the very first two Marvel superheroes, the Human Torch and Submariner. Now, the Human Torch and Submariner come out in 1939 together. They are actually adversaries to each other, but they unite to fight the Nazis in 1940. And they will continue to unite to fight Hitler until 1945. These were supposed to show how the Allied forces should fight back. So by air, by land, and by sea. After the war and we get to what's called the Silver Age of comics, we see a grouping of superheroes together. So probably the most famous, if you've seen even one of the movies, you've heard of the Avengers. So the Avengers are introduced in 1963. They bring back Captain America. Captain America actually goes away for a while. But when they bring back Captain America, they're fighting modern Nazism of that day. And so that's where we have the introduction of the Hydra Society, which is modeled after the Thule Society of the Nazis. So comics have always been involved in this and trying to teach children, and to a lesser extent, their parents and society as a whole, we have to fight racism and bigotry. The last two are not actually related to the Holocaust as such, but they're related to Jewish identity. Because you'll notice that all of these comic book heroes I've shown you, none of them are overtly Jewish. All of them were made by Jewish creators, but none of them are overtly Jewish. The first overtly Jewish superhero isn't until 1975, and that's Moon Knight. Moon Knight is not just Jewish, he is the son of a rabbi. And so this is the costume for the TV show Moon Knight, if you watched it on Netflix. I'm not Netflix, Disney. And now I will say the odd thing maybe is Moon Knight becomes a avatar of Khonshu. Khonshu is an Egyptian god. So a Jew being the avatar of an Egyptian god, there might be some issues with that. But it did mark that shift from the 40s to the 60s where superheroes weren't Jewish. Now we have a Jewish superhero. Now we have an openly Jewish superhero. Moon Knight also is one of the first superheroes to tackle mental health. Moon Knight, today we would say he has what's called dissociative identity disorder. Back then it would have been called multiple personalities. And it shows not only how that manifests, but how he tries to deal with it in his life, rather than just glossing it over. That goes against the code, because the comics code would not have wanted you to show mental disorders. There was a huge panic after the movie Sybil. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of it. There was a book written, but the movie actually made it more famous. After that movie came out, there was a huge panic that all these people were being diagnosed with multiple personalities. And so we know kids read things, they identify with things. So they were trying to make sure kids don't identify with, oh, I've got DID or multiple personalities. And then the next introduced in 1981 by Marvel is Sabra. Now, Sabra is a mutant. I'll take it closer in just a second. And because of that, she is actually trained by the Mossad. She is mired in controversy since the very beginning. I will not deny that. In her initial comics, there was controversy over how the display of Palestinians and Arabs were represented. But she was actually introduced as a foil to Hulk, because the Hulk, while being a superhero, is incredibly destructive. So she was meant to actually be a foil to Hulk. She is considered the first Israeli superheroine. And so you see her here in her regular dress, and then she becomes Sabra, the superhero. And if you notice here in the background, it's one of the first times we also have Hebrew writing being used in the comics. United States. This was made by, this was made by Marvel in the United States. Yes. Now notice what I like here about the editor's note. The word Sabra denotes a native-born Israeli, the name derived from an indigenous form of a fruit, the prickly pear, which possessed of a sweet interior and a spiny outer surface to protect from its enemies. So these are how when I was researching this topic and I was putting this all together, how I tied all of this together, because it is not a tenuous connection, but you actually have to look at it deeper than just reading a comic book. And that kind of takes me to the last part of the speech or the presentation, which is memory. How do we use comics today for memory, zachor, and preserve that for the next generation? And so we have the modern graphic novel. Now, a graphic novel is a comic, but it is much longer than a comic. Comics, if you ever collected them, they were really maybe like 10 to 20 pages. Graphic novels can be a full book. So the first is Mouse. Mouse being probably the most well-known of all Holocaust graphic novels. But there's a lot of controversy surrounding it because of the fact of how it depicts the Holocaust. Should it have depicted the Holocaust? Can art depict the Holocaust? Art Spiegelman, who I used his quote at the beginning, kind of encapsulated why he did it this way, because you can't just depict the Holocaust in words. You can't just depict it in art. You can't just depict it in sound. It has to be all of it. It's the only way to preserve that memory. One of the things that is called when you see any kind of tragedy, whether it's a natural disaster, the Holocaust, war, and it's constantly being shown to you, which is what we see a lot on social media. That's called tragedy porn, because you're just spreading it for the reaction. You're not spreading it for learning. You're not spreading it for memory. So he published this actually over the course of 11 years. It wasn't initially published in one book that was collected later on. And it was published between 1980 and 1991. And it depicted these events in what we would call graphic, not the picture, but the description style. Art Spiegelman is the second generation survivor. The book is mainly about his father, Vladik, but it does also have parts that are about his mother. And the most infamous part of that is the scene of when his mother commits suicide and how that affected him. So Spiegelman is dealing with not just the Holocaust, but intergenerational trauma and mental health. He said that he viewed the comic strip as a format for a way that art can realistically and correctly display the horrors of the Holocaust. But it also pushed back against Nazi art aesthetics. He purposefully did it in this way to push back against Nazi ideas. The Nazi art aesthetic was a big part of how they would de-Jewify in English. I can't say the German term, not Nazi Germany, because they had viewed that Jewish ideas and Jewish beliefs had incorporated themselves into all forms of art within Germany. Now, one of the issues, though, that even to this day I kind of always feel weird about is the fact that everyone's displayed as an animal. So Jews are displayed as rats and mice. Germans are displayed as dogs, cats, sorry. Germans are displayed as cats. Poles are displayed as pigs, and Brits and Americans are displayed as dogs. Personally, I kind of feel that kind of reinforces the idea that Jews didn't fight back because mice run and hide and scurry. When we know that's not true. We know Jews fought back, not just in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or in the uprisings in camps, but even in just the fact that they lived. That is fighting back. We also know that there were good Polish people that did risk their lives to save Jews. And by displaying them as pigs, it kind of enforces anti-Polish sentiment, which is an issue within the Jewish community.
The animal description, question in the chat.
Jews were rats and mice. Polish people were pigs. The Germans were cats, and Americans and Brits were dogs. So Americans, Brits, and Germans, I don't have as much of an issue with the way they're displayed. Cats hunt mice. It makes sense. Dogs and cats, they don't get along. But I really do kind of have an issue with the way Jews and Poles are displayed. But one of the ways that he gets the concept of how it affects him and not just his father is that the panels go back and forth in time. So it shows something that his father would go through and then how it would affect him, how something his mother would go through and how it would affect him. And he basically says this is to show a few different things with memory. Memory is fallible. Memory is not perfect. Memory is shaped by emotion. It's shaped by time. The memory of when it actually happens to 1 year, to 10 years, to 20 and 30 years later shapes how you see it. And also perception. Vladek is one person who perceives what happens. Spiegelman is another. So they're both perceiving these events in different ways. And he calls it fictional truth. I'm not sure I like the title because it is what happened to his father. But he calls it fictional truth because he says it's what my father remembers. So it's the truth of what my father remembers, but I'm showing it to you in a fiction way because you can never actually experience what he did. So it presents an interesting, almost cognitive dissonance on how it's shown and what he's trying to get across. So for this one, he also said it was therapy. Art Spiegelman said this was his therapy. He had a massive amount of mental health issues, especially of the fact about when his mother committed suicide. And this was his way of dealing with all of that and his way of dealing with the way his parents raised him. And more importantly, it's the way of how he was constantly compared to the firstborn child who doesn't survive the war. The other very famous one that's very recently coming out is Anne Frank's diary has been turned into a graphic novel. This is not without its controversies, massive amount of controversies. This is one of the most banned books in the United States today because of the way it's depicting things. And even the non-graphic novel diary is banned. And that is because Mouse has been banned quite a few times since it was printed. I remember when I moved to Texas and I was in 7th grade, I was reading Mouse and my English teacher, why are you reading that? You're not allowed to read that. Okay, yeah, whatever. Anne Frank has been serialized. Anne Frank has been made into a book. It's been made into a movie. It's been made into a play. The graphic novel is just the next iteration of it. But as I said earlier, the graphic novel is not based off of what most of us probably have read. It is based off of the full diary. The full diary has been in print since the 1980s. Prior to the 1980s, the diary has been edited. I think that's something we don't discuss enough. And the first editor was Anne, God bless you. Anne edited her own diary because she was trying to turn it into a book, a fictional book based off of real events. Then it was edited by her father, and her father edited out all of the instances where Anne mentions her mother in a negative light and all of the discussions of her sexuality. The only part that's left in is where she mentions a little bit, oh, Peter's cute, right? The graphic novel is not based off that edition. It's based off the full edition. And so there are parts in there where she's talking about exploring herself, kissing a girl, and the way she talks about her mother. And so those three things have caused it to be banned in a lot of different states around the country. It does bring in the idea of, is it an appropriate adaptation? But I think that's the idea, is that it's an adaptation. We don't know what the final product would have been had Anne survived. Anne might have not edited out any of that stuff. She might have, she might not have. But it's also not meant to be by itself. This is a companion to a movie that came out in 2021 by Ari Folman. Ari Folman is also one of the writers of the book. And that movie is called Where's Anne Frank? And it's about Anne's friend, Kitty. And you'll see if you watch the movie, you read the graphic novel, it's the same style. They're meant to go together. And I think that's probably why the book is being misinterpreted, is because it's only being taken on its own rather than being paired with a movie that was created. One of the other big issues is that the dialogue in the book is clearly made up. Some of the things in there are what Anne wrote, people said, but not all of them. And if Anne said, Peter said this, my mom said this, that's Anne's perception. So we don't actually know if that's what was fully said. And so people are afraid that it could cause the wrong perception of the people in the annex with her. But I think this also highlights what Spiegelman said. Memory is fallible, and there are going to always be issues with that. It doesn't detract from the truthfulness of it, but it gives us a fuller picture of what we're hearing or seeing. The drawings, I went and looked at the drawings. The drawings are a very newer style. They're not the classic comic style that we would have seen in comic books of the 50s. Spiegelman's style is rooted in that classic style, even though it was done in the 80s. So it's probably why people also have an issue, because graphic novels, they see the word graphic, they assume it's going to sex, drugs, and violence, rather than really realizing graphics just means drawing. But a lot of other supporters of this say that it's only fiction because of the fact that it's an adaptation. If we had stuck to the original diary and not drawn anything or drawn everything, then it would have been fine. But you can't do that. I mean, Anne's unedited version book is about that thick. I don't know if you can see that in the camera. The graphic novels can't do that. They're meant to show things in a faster format. They also can't show everything. Some examples of other modern graphic novels, oh, that's a little too close, is Rome, 16th of October, 1943. We actually have this here in the center in our library. This is about the deportation of Italian Jews to Auschwitz. Graphic novels, they are going to be limited though in what they can do. They are limited based off the fact that they rely on images and rather than text. Space on the page, complexity of that, how do you fit things on that page? And also, what do you depict? The Holocaust is a horrific event that defies imagination. So how do you show what happened? Do you show what happened? Where do we draw the line? And then this actually, it's called chutzpah. I love chutzpah. I did a PD with the Philadelphia Holocaust Museum about 2 or 3 years ago. And this is a graphic novel that they produce every month. And it is to show how Jews helped themselves during the Holocaust. So it does include some of your famous superheroes in some of the early editions. It does also include some very famous Righteous Among the Nations, but it was mainly to show Jews can and did defend themselves. And Jews did live Jewishly, even knowing that the Nazis tried to kill them for it. So, oh, too far. Overall, the graphic novels and comics, they provide a medium for Holocaust memory. They provide a medium to begin that discussion for children, but they're not the end all, just as a testimony or a fiction book or a diary are not the end all. They are a tool within our kit when we talk about the Holocaust. So I thank you guys. I went a little over than I thought I would, but I open it up to questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and Carol will come to you and I will do my best to answer.
Thank you. That was great, Kris. This is actually a comment just for the room. It's a book recommendation. Michael Chabon.
Sorry.
Michael Chabon's written a fictionalized story about the two authors of Superman called The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. So if you're kind of not into graphic novels or comics, but want to learn a bit more about that and kind of the story about the those early comics, I would highly recommend the novel.
Back and then on the front.
Thank you, Kris. Really interesting talk. So my question is, we tend to think of the concept of the new Jew as being, the Israeli Jew. And you've introduced that and was that an attempt by the writers to basically establish that concept in the American or English world, or was it a reflection of the Israeli new Jew? How do you see that in terms of, and obviously, of course, in terms of American exceptionalism?
Yeah, I'm not sure because Sabra's not that popular of all of the superheroes that are involved. I mean, I had heard of her, like just the name. I'd never read any of the comics that involved her. My first, yeah. I see what you're saying. Okay. It's the overtly Jewish aspect. Yes, I think that's where the change is. Just like Moon Knight. So rather than using the alien or the superhero in general to be the Jew of the time, now it's Jews can be superheroes and openly Jewish. Moon Knight and Sabra are the example of that. A lot of those old superheroes are also being re-released with new storylines. And in those new storylines, they are openly Jewish. So for example, Magneto has 2 children, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Now the TV show kind of glosses over all of that. If you have children or grandchildren that watch this, they'll know what I'm talking about. But it could come up in that she is a Holocaust 2nd generation survivor. So she is Jewish, she is Romani. And I think that would be really a good way then to introduce the fact that superheroes can be the people that we're surrounded by. They don't have to be alien. They don't have to be another culture. They can be based on real cultures here on Earth. And I think based off my research, that's what they were trying to do, is introduce that concept. Marlene.
I read some graphic novels recently by Ken Crimstein, and those were I passed them on to Nicole, and she thought that would be useful. They're graphic novels made out of the accounts of young Yiddish teenagers from just before the Holocaust, of their autobiographies. And the other one is Will Eisner, who did the plot. And
Yeah,
did you not have another 20 minutes to write?
I could have dedicated a whole hour to Will Eisner, and he wrote a book, graphic novel called The Plot, and it explains the protocols of the Elders of Zion and how it's spread. Can we turn the sound up? They can't hear in the back. So we'll turn the sound up. Will Eisner is a very famous cartoonist. I left him out because of the fact that, oh, too loud now. Okay, I left him out just because of the fact of time, and I wouldn't have done it justice. We do have the plot here. It's somewhere in the library that you can see. And it basically, he's trying to show how you spread ideas even through something as simple as a comic, and teach children why this is spreading. Because our modern age, we are seeing that being spread through different mediums than just newspapers and books. We have the plot here. We actually need to start using it.
Just the thing about the plot that I particularly liked was that you always read about a paragraph summary of, the protocol's history. And this really, really makes it clear and grippy.
It's a really good mesh between a graphic novel and a regular book. It's a good mesh because kids, I say kids these days. Yeah, I know the irony's not lost on me. Students don't necessarily read full books anymore. And that is an issue, but that's a whole nother topic. You don't have time for that. So this is a good way for them to see a picture, read a paragraph. I got it, I understand it. See a picture, read a paragraph, I got it, I understand it. So it's a nice mesh between the two. Yeah.
When I was a kid, I thought Superman looked Jewish. I still think he looks Jewish. And it really annoyed me when one of the movies that came out, I forget which one, there's so many, one of them actually presents him as Jesus, which who's Jesus, who's Jewish, okay, but still I was so offended that they made it into a Christian story. But there you go. So I should not watch so many.
David in the back.
Just a comment from the Zoom. It's not a question. Laval was the prime minister of Marshal Pétain.
Yeah, Pétain, I know.
In
Yeah.
Vichy, France, and he was executed after liberation of France.
I don't know everything about the Holocaust because there's so much to learn about the Holocaust. I know Pétain, who was the leader of Vichy France and also of World War I in France. David.
You explained how the Marvel system developed from the concept of American exceptionalism and how it spread and what huge influence it had. Has the same thing happened within any other country? Looking at the success of the Marvel factory, I mean, many other countries, for instance, don't even read English.
Yeah.
So were Marvel comics translated, or did, for instance, China have its own set of comics about Chinese heroes?
So Marvel and DC being the biggest American producers of comics, that's their basis, American exceptionalism. Of course, they have been translated into multiple languages and are found all over the world. I do know that if we were to talk about, it's not a comic because they call it manga, which is a different style altogether in Japan. But that, in my personal opinion, probably has even a bigger following than American comic books, is Japanese manga. I mean, you're not just talking books, you're books, movies, TV on a scale unseen. You do see that in China as well. They have their own industry. I'm not sure I've ever seen any, but they're going to have their own industry, internal. If it's been exported, it's probably only going to be exported to countries that would accept it. Technically, America should, First Amendment and all of that, but I've never seen them. And South Korea also has their own version of manga that is very popular. India, my understanding, is developing one. The girl who can answer that is not here because I didn't research India. But Europe as a whole, I don't really know very many in Europe. Oh, Rin Tin Tin. Asterix in Belgium, Tintin, which if I'm in France, okay. Oh, Tintin. And you did have the Smurfs, which are an own issue, because the Smurfs are, some say, embedded in anti-Semitism. And you also had oh God, I used to watch this as a child on TV. They had the little things, they lived under the sea. Snorks. Yeah. Which also come from the same producers as the Smurfs. But again, I really don't know much about them. I never watched or read Tintin. It wasn't my time. It was Japanese manga, I would say, is probably the biggest one in today's world after America, is Japanese manga. Yeah.
I have a question. You were talking about how there are no.
Sorry.
In the 70s, there were first Israeli or Jewish superhero out in the open. Are there any Muslim or Christians? It's look like none of them are. Sorry, I will ask it again. You were mentioning before that only in the 70s we have our first Jewish, Israeli, openly Jewish superhero. I just wonder, I never saw a Muslim superhero or a Christians, and it seems like none of them promoting one religions per se.
Usually they don't promote religion in general. There is a Muslim superhero, Miss Marvel, and she had a TV show. It was actually a really good TV show. Miss Marvel was a young Pakistani girl who grew up in a traditional American Muslim home. The reprints of a lot of these superheroes are getting new backstories to include this diversification. As for Christians specifically, if they're coming from America, and this is a total guess, so take this with a massive grain of salt, you're not going to see that because that would be too insulting to the Christian right. And they would not want to see that happen. I have not known of any. If you do know of any that are openly Christian, tell me, but I don't know of any because of just American politics. I wouldn't see that.
Sorry, would it be a problem having graphic novels coming out of a Muslim society? I mean, like, Pakistani comics. Would that be a problem because of the?
So
know.
there is a Pakistani comic superhero who they discussed her when Miss Marvel came out. I don't remember her name.
Yeah, but that's an American.
No, in
novel.
Pakistan. They made one after Miss Marvel came out,
Oh.
but I don't know her name. And she wears a sari, and I want to say her name is Scheherazade. Don't quote me. Somebody has a phone, look it up. They can tell me the name. I don't know her name. Yes.
According to Wikipedia, Marvel have a Christian superhero called Illuminator.
Oh, there you go. See, I learn something new every day.
Illuminator.
I'm going to take about 2 more questions because I'm going to start coughing a lot if I keep talking. There's no more questions. I thank everybody on Zoom. No more questions on Zoom. I thank you guys. Thank you for coming. Again, we can take this into a lot of more directions than just what I've covered. This was just scratching the surface. So thank you guys and have a wonderful day.